listening to The Donor Doctor Show, where your host, James Newberry, will help you improve the health of your fundraising. Now over to James.
Welcome to The Donor Doctor Show. Today I'm going to answer questions from listeners like you. This first question comes to me from a young person who's interested in becoming a fundraising copywriter. And he asks, is it better to work as a freelancer or directly for a creative agency? Now, he didn't ask this, but you can also, of course, get great experience working for a nonprofit directly or a political campaign, that does their fundraising in-house. But let me answer his question. I think he'd be better off working at an agency initially. There's so many advantages. First is the training. And it's not just from the supervisor, but others on the creative staff. A typical agency also will send, its newer copywriters to courses from the Direct Marketing Association and things like that. And that's very valuable. Second advantage, of course, benefits. Typically an agency would pay at least some of your health care, might have a 401k match, things like that. And if you're young, you probably don't value that as much as you should. There's a structure. And I'm not just talking about going into the office, which is useful when you have to do something as painful as writing copy. And I say painful, if you're new to writing copy, it is a chore. It is difficult, even if you enjoy it. And in knowing you have to be at a place and do that, that's useful. But I'm thinking of structure in a bigger sense than that. Just the computers and all that kind of stuff that you have to have on your own. Setting up emails and things like that. If you're young, maybe that's not that difficult for you, but trust me, I've had problems and I've had to have my son here and fix things and printers and, it's just that structure's nice. The interchange of ideas. Now, I write copy in a beautiful place, but if I have two teasers and want to know which one's better, the only people I have to ask are the deer, and they ain't talking back. So it's a lot nicer going to your neighbor and 10 feet away and say, hey, do you like this teaser or that teaser better? So that the interchange of ideas is very good. At an agency, the work comes to you easily. You don't have to hunt for your own food. They come and you give them the assignments, or you can volunteer for work you're interested in. However it works at a particular agency, but it comes to you easily is my point. It's also easier to become an expert on a client. You have the lifetime of the client. You can see what worked and what failed, and trust me, what's failed is almost as valuable as what's worked. That's nice. Having endorsed working in an agency, there are some negative things. Obviously, there's less flexibility. You got to fight traffic. But something you probably don't think about is there's a lot of groupthink, and I think it's pretty much pervasive. Agencies, people start believing the same things. And they're often unwilling to get off a belief. It becomes what should just be something that's tested becomes dogma. And once something's dogma, it's very hard to get people away from believing it. A lot of agencies don't like dissenters. And one of my favorite people was Frank, who I worked with in the 80s. And he had a different perspective, and they just didn't want to hear it because they thought that was they described it as a cancer. Well, it's not a cancer to have a different opinion, okay? So I think there's a level of conformity that I don't miss not working at an agency. Freelance works better for more established copywriters. I'm thinking of Richard Armstrong. If you haven't listened to his episode, you really should. He's one of the greatest ones out there, and certainly probably the best example of a fundraising copywriter that went on to even bigger and better things as more of a business or commercial copywriter. Freelance, you also get a diversity of assignments. You work with a variety of different agencies, and they all do things differently. And that's interesting too. Now, this is a hot topic because more and more agencies are going to freelancers, and I can see their attraction. It's tough to fire people, it costs a lot of money and stuff. So if you're not happy with somebody, you just don't use them anymore. You don't even have to tell them you're not using them anymore often. So I can see why agencies like that, but I think that they may be missing is that copywriting is not a commodity. The gap between an excellent and a mediocre copywriter is much greater than say, an excellent and mediocre, list broker, for example, or event planner even. So it's something that I think is a mistake. If I were doing it, I would do both. I would have in-house, and I would also use freelancers. I think that's the wisest course. And that's what some agencies do, by the way, the wisest ones, I think. The second question, is it better to stay at one agency or work at several? And of course, this has changed over time. Back in the day, people would work all their life at one agency. They'd have or one job, and they might have a pension. Well, those days are gone. First off, a lot of the companies, they don't even honor their pensions. I could tell you, my uncle's a Delta pilot, and I think that the Delta paid 30 cents on the dollar or something. A lot. This is just a common thing. So the day of security is over. If they're not going to show you that kind of security, why should you do the same? As I'm just trying to be fair here to all parties. The late, great Craig Capp is one of the best guys I ever worked with, and he did not believe, and that was the conventional wisdom back then, you should stick at one, he didn't believe it. He'd work a few years and he'd try to parlay that into a better job. And he did that several times. And I don't know if I mentioned it before when talking about Craig, but he had a big investor who was willing to give him $2 or $3 million, and they were setting it up for his own agency. He decided it was too much pressure for him. That's not what he didn't want to be responsible for the financial well-being of so many people. But, that's how well he was regarded in the advertising industry. And he did it by working a few years and jumping, to a different agency. And the reason you have to do that, and I've seen also some studies on this, is that a lot of agencies are just not a room for advancement, So that's why you should be switching jobs. Now, I'm not saying every 6 months, obviously. You don't want to have a reputation if you see that, you think, well, this guy's either difficult to work with, or that you don't want to overdo it, I suppose. But I don't think, and of course I sound like a hypocrite because I worked in an agency for 15 years. But do I think that was the wisest thing? No. I think you want to get your experience, and you want to test other places. I think you'll do better in your career. Third question. Should I go to a fundraising school or a mastermind or something? It was some other question about whether these were worth it or not. And if you're starting out, I don't think they are worth it. I think you want to make sure that you're first off interested in becoming a fundraising copywriter. You want to see that you're good at that. I wouldn't spend a lot of money on that. Again, you should try to work at an agency, become an intern or some other job and try to work your way up in that structure before you dole out money for a copywriting coach. Now, last week I had David Garfinkel, who's a great copywriter. You should go to his podcast, Copywriters Podcast. Great information that he gives out for free. Now, I think he does he'll evaluate your copy, and I think that's an excellent idea to do that, but only after you've been in the business. So I wouldn't dole out a lot of money up front. So I'm not saying that these people don't provide value, but you have to be, they're not qualifying. It's not like a school where before you can get in their engineering program, you have to get, such a certain score on SAT. So what I'm saying is if you don't have a certain level of skill already, I think you're probably wasting your money on a lot of these schools and stuff. Fourth question, how do you avoid plagiarism in direct mail? Are the standards the same as in academics? Well, fortunately, they're not. You rarely have to footnote things. Although, with the level of trust today, certainly in an insert, if you make some claims, why not footnote it? It gives more proof, more confidence in it. It's interesting. A lot of people have been accused of copywriting, of plagiarism. The late, great Dr. Martin Luther King. If you don't believe me, go on Google and see, did he plagiarize his thesis? They say he did. Boston University, so went to. Of a lesser level, a lot of the most famous historians, David McCullough, Stephen Ambrose, have been accused of plagiarism. In truth, it was, misattribution. I mean, it's not what an average person would consider plagiarism, but, academic, fortunately, direct mail is not as bad as academic. You usually won't have troubles, but still it is an issue. It's an important thing for the morale of an agency that plagiarism is, if not a fireable offense, at least something that people are reprimanded from. And I mean by that, it has to be more than that the person doesn't receive rewards for it. You don't get a fee for it. It really does hurt morale if those kind of standards are not, in place. So it's definitely frowned upon. But I think in direct mail, plagiarism is different. When I write copy, I don't feel guilty if I write something else for a different client, because I came up with it. But you have to think about what you write for a particular client is owned by either that client or the agency. I guess it depends on the contract, or both, perhaps. Who knows? It doesn't necessarily owned by you. Unless your contract, and I don't think it would be. So you, even though you don't feel guilty about it, you probably should, because it's really not yours. So, that's something that now it's interesting. Something that's not plagiarism is if you inherit a client or you work at a nonprofit, you're free to use any of the things that have been written by others. So that's not plagiarism. So because it wasn't owned by them. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The standards aren't as strict, but you shouldn't rip people off either. It's bad for the morale, as I say, and you don't need to. Interestingly, I don't even plagiarize myself. I try not to anyway. I try to, even on the same topic for a different agency, I rewrote it, a package recently. Because, it'd be embarrassing if they read both. You'd be unhappy, and, you just don't want to do it. Something that's not plagiarism, but it's good manners, is if a colleague comes up with something, really clever, to at least ask them, if it'd be okay for you to use it too, and give them a head start, because others can see it too. Everybody's seated on the same mail. So it's eventually, if it's a good idea, others are going to adopt it. But give them a head start, ask them about it. That's a good way. You want to keep your colleagues happy. That's a valuable thing. What mistakes do failing copywriters make? I thought that was an interesting question. Well, the worst copy test is kind of an interesting story. Was from a friend of mine, Matt. And Matt was a great guy. I met him playing cards. Although we did overlap a little bit at the University of Texas. He had a master's in economics. And he never did well in his professional career. And I couldn't figure out why. Because he's got a really likable personality. Funny. I say likable, though. He was a bad loser. A really bad loser, and this made him a poor poker player. So he gave that up. But I know other people like that, and they have been successful. So I was wondering why he was such a he'd always switching jobs, had a hard time keeping a job, and I bought life insurance from him, and that's a tough job, selling life insurance. So he came to me one time, he went out to lunch, he says, I really need to change my life. I was wondering if you could, I do have sales experience. I think it'd be useful in becoming a fundraising copywriter. Could you give me a job? And I said, well, I can get you a copy test. So I gave him the boss's book, and I give him some samples, and he doesn't do anything. But 6 months later, he calls me up, he's desperate. And I give him the thing. I even give him a sample that's very similar to what he needs to do. And I say, try to make it like this letter that I wrote. And he came back, a few days later. He wrote a few paragraphs out by hand, and it was just nothing. It was awful. The late Declan Bransfield, I gave it to him. I thought about just trashing it. He said, it's the worst copy test I've ever seen. And I think the problem was the guy just wouldn't listen to instructions. I have no idea what it was. He said, well, I didn't like your letter. Well, that's not the point of whether you like my letter or not. My letter had netted money. It was a control package. You needed to get a job. You needed to read. And I said, did you read the boss's book? He says, no, I don't have time for that. Well, this is what failure looks like. Now, most people aren't, this hard-headed as this guy. But, they make other mistakes. They get to a level where they're mediocre and they stop growing. That's probably the most common mistake. They don't think that copywriting is as difficult. Maybe they don't have it as appreciation. The other thing I see is that people skim rather than they devour the masters. For example, I asked somebody if they'd read Caples, and he says, oh yeah, John Caples, yeah, I read him. And I said, well, what are the three kinds of headlines? What do you mean? And he says, well, I'll give you one. One's a curiosity headline. That's one of them, isn't it? Yeah, the curiosity. I don't remember the other two. Well, how closely did they read Caples is my point. News and self-interest are the two headlines if you're interested. You need to know that. You haven't really read Caples if you don't know the three kind of headlines that there are. I mean, this is just, he's just reading it kind of like, I don't know, some women read Cosmopolitan. They read every other article. They browse it. They look at the pictures. I don't know. That's not really, there should be a different word, study rather than read maybe. I don't know. But a lot of people, I've been unimpressed by, I don't know if the schools maybe are too easy nowadays. I don't know. With these 4.8 grade averages, in my day you could get over 4.0. But anyway, I'm digressing. But people are not putting enough time into the study. They spend a lot of time on a particular project, but they're not grounded. It's sort of like this, I don't know if you saw 60 Minutes the other day about this building in San Francisco that's tilting. Well, they didn't spend enough time anchoring it to the bedrock. They kind of, so now they got a big mess on their hands. So I don't know what they're going to do. But I think a lot of people, their copies like that. It's not grounded. So it's kind of goes and, it tilts. It's not good. They put a lot of effort into it because they're not grounded. They didn't spend, like Richard Vigry in his 80s, he still says he still spends 2 hours a day on marketing, reading like samples and books and stuff. So, he could coast, okay, what he knows. But these new people don't spend 30 minutes a week. After the first month or two when they've read, maybe they read, I don't know, Claude Hopkins' book one time. And they think they're ready to go. Well, that's not that easy, okay? Trust me on that. If you don't want to, you'll find out for yourself. I'm telling the truth. Question number 6. When I say it's a question, it was really more of a rant. Somebody didn't agree with my view on art. Okay. Well, that's fine. It's a free country. You can believe whatever you like. But I'm going to read from Drayton Bird. Okay, he's pretty good. Drayton Bird. This is what David Ogilvy said about this book, Common Sense Direct and Digital Marketing. Read it and reread it. It contains the knowledge of a lifetime. That's David Ogilvy, founder of Ogilvy and Mather. Now, if you don't know who David Ogilvy is, you're kind of lost there. You're really not in the fundraising field. But anyway, here it is. And he's talking about charities. And he gives 9 suggestions here. He says, be amateur seeming. People like charities to use their money wisely. That's why you should mention how little money is wasted on administration and why charity ads often work better if they are set by the newspaper and look cheap. In a series of tests for Help the Aged, we found that setting our ads in reproduction typewriter face significantly lifted response. So these slick packages usually don't work. Now, that's not to say that, I told a lot about, gold foil I've had success with. Certainly, if you're mailing a calendar or a certificate, you want to make that look good because that's what people are going to benefit. The front-end premium like a calendar, if you send something nice, obviously people are going to think, that they should reciprocate if they get benefit from it. So, if you don't want to listen to me, I mean, I agree. I could tell you my own test results, but there's Drayton Bird, okay? He's a living legend. So I understand this person is an artist, and, I don't want to take away from their business, but I'm just telling you that, the slick packages usually don't work as well. So I'm not saying they don't have talent, but at the end of the day, it's about whether it produces, isn't it? I mean, obviously what the client thinks matters too. But more than anything, I think results matter. And I think that's going to be common for a lot of groups. Certainly if it's a charity that's smaller, I think you do want the homey look. Wendy Newman, certainly, she did a lot of her packages in typewriter rough, and that's what she found. So, that's something to think about. Now, it's interesting. Yesterday, speaking of this, I had to pay for it myself. I went to a speech writing class, and they had John Shosky was a speechwriter for Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and we talked about President Reagan. He, who wasn't necessarily the best dresser, particularly at the beginning. He'd wear brown suits, and John Shosky said you should always wear blue or gray, and that is the traditional advice. And I certainly think if you were a banker or a businessman of any kind, that's definitely it's good advice. I wonder, though, President Reagan would often wear brown suits, and I do think that kind of made him seem like he was more approachable. He came across less like, say, the elder Bush, we went to Yale. Reagan was a common man. He was from working class family. I do think that his look about him, less waspy, if you will, I think it helped. The John Shosky did not agree with me, so he said, you're supposed to look presidential. Maybe so. Maybe it helped with some and not others. Who knows? But your look does matter, and it doesn't necessarily, but not slick necessarily. Okay, so sometimes that homey look, like you're not dressed in an Armani suit. Armani suit looks great on Pat Riley, the coach of used to be the Lakers coach, or somebody like that. But if you're, a politician, and I don't know, in Southern Illinois, maybe something, a brown suit might go over better. So who knows? So that kind of varies. I'm just saying you should test it, okay? And a lot of people I find are just kind of like, they just believe things, and it's really hard for them to get off that viewpoint. Even if they see test results, we'll say, well, we'll need to test it again. I mean, that's just what I found. What's the problem in the biggest problem in the fundraising or marketing field? And I would go back to Drayton Bird. I mean, he sums it up right here, I think, best about just a lack of talent. Let me quote him. One reason I have never believed that the direct marketing would conquer the world is very simple. There simply aren't good enough people around to handle the volume of expenditure involved. One of the great current problems in our industry, quite simply, is the poor caliber of much of our work. Just about anywhere I go in the world, if I am interviewed by a trade paper or newspaper, the question arises in one form or another, what do you think about junk mails? Direct marketers loathe the idea of being seen as producers of junk mail. So much so that a while ago, a British magazine, Direct Response, held a competition amongst its readers to find a more agreeable phrase for what they produced. Of course, the truth is that if people think the mail we send out is junk, then there is not much we can do to alter that view or that expression, apart from improving the quality of that mail. Again, it goes back to the quality of the caliber. I mean, that's Drayton Bird. Again. Eighth question, what are your favorite podcasts? Well, I mentioned David Garfinkel, Copywriter's podcast from last week. He gives away a lot of great information. I mean, it's just, particularly his early ones on headlines are worth listening to a couple times. But I mean, I like them all. So, I mean, that one is just great value. Michael Senoff, I don't know if he still has it, but he interviewed in hard-to-get seminars. Just Senoff is Senoff. He interviewed all the experts. I mean, Herschel Gordon Lewis. I mean, just a long list of interviews, and I've listened to every one of those, and I think he's a great source. Wesley Murph, he interviews a lot of people. You can go on YouTube and see David Ogilvy yourself or Gary Halbert. Ben Settle, he has some emails. He's an amusing guy. He'd be worth seeing. But I mean, you can with iTunes or whatever, you can find your own you like. But those are a few of my favorite. Well, anyway, I want to thank you for listening today. And until next time, this is the Donor Doctor signing out. Bye.